Well, hello and good afternoon and good morning to all of you around Australia. My name is Luke Sheehy, the Chief Executive Officer of Universities Australia. Welcome to the second of our solution series in conversation. Can I start by acknowledging that I am coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that courtesy and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us on this discussion today. Of course, recognising the various unceded lands from which you're coming from on this call throughout our great continent today. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Barney Glover AO, the inaugural Chief Commissioner of the Australian Tertiary Education Commission. You're only 8 days officially into the job. What a delight to have you join us. And might I start by saying a record turnout today, I believe 1,262. As you said to me earlier, Barney, that doesn't preclude multiple viewers on screens.
That's very true.
We're going to take this as an absolute landslide win for not only the ATEC, the role of UA, but of course the solution series. It's a really topical time. We've got lots to talk about. People don't want to hear from me. They hear from me all the time. They certainly want to hear from you, Barney. Very warm welcome to our conversation today, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Luke. It is great to be with you. I really do appreciate the opportunity so early in my term to engage with you and UA. I'd like to begin, of course, by attaching myself to your acknowledgement of country. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. I want to acknowledge that the ATEC, following from the Accord, sees our First Nations people at the heart of what we're doing, of the recommendations from the Accord and about the future of our sector. And I know during the interim phase of the ATEC, we had the pleasure of working with Larissa Barent and now with Tom Calma. We'll be announcing a First Nations Commissioner in the near future. So we've had great support so far. So I want to acknowledge all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are on the webinar with us today, and I look forward to their questions as well. And again, thanks very much for having me.
It's a great pleasure, Barney, and I think there's obviously lots of people online, and I look forward to your questions. And I hope that they're spicy ones. In the spirit of the Universities Accord interim report, they're spiky. Those of you might remember the interim report came down with an echidna on the front. That was now feels like years ago, because it was, frankly, but I wanted to start with the actual Accord and the role of the ATEC. I was reflecting on the fact that we've now had the final report of the Universities Accord since February of 2024. That meaty 407 pages with the 47 recommendations in multiple parts. What a whopper. But a tribute, I think, to the work of the commissioners and the work of you, and of course Mary O'Kane and Larissa and Jenny Macklin and others in the development of that. And one of the centerpieces of that, of course, was the Australian Tertiary Education Commission recommendation. A steward, a buffer body, something to take the politics out of short-term thinking and set our sector into long-term thinking. It's a big role, Barney. I can't believe you've signed up for it. It's going to take a lot of energy. Usually former vice-chancellors, just wander into the kind of eminent kind of regal status of, providing commentary from time to time, but you're all in. This is a full-time gig. We're very grateful for your time, but we're also grateful for the energy and commitment that you give to the sector. Let's talk about the ATEC. We had a bill that passed the Parliament. Universities Australia made our point. We've got a few amendments up. What is your role? Tell us about what stewardship means in the Australian tertiary education system in 2026.
Thanks, Luke. I want to pick up first your comment a moment ago about the Accord, and I want to also recognise Mary O'Kane. So I'm hoping Mary has an opportunity to listen in today. Very much the architect of the Accord recommendations was the interim Chief Commissioner of the ATEC in its interim stage last year, handed the reins to me earlier this year, and now I'm in the hot seat from the 1st of July. and also acknowledging my other commissioners, and particularly acknowledge Fiona Nash. And Fiona was on the Accord panel and is continuing as one of our commissioners alongside of Stephen Duckett and David Coltman. I'm very pleased with my two colleagues who are joining us. Stephen, well known to the sector with his background both in public service, in health, and the work he's done on health pricing, the work he's doing for us on costing and pricing, of course, connection to the sector in a range of ways, very eminent person. David, of course, has been the director of TAFE South Australia, so knows the TAFE tertiary system really well, and now, and I think formerly a DVC and a dual sector university. So David brings a lot of that tertiary system perspective to the ATEC. And of course, Fiona, being Regional Education Commissioner, strong regional connection. So I'm very pleased with the Commission, but I do want to acknowledge Mary and the work she did. You're right, those recommendations landed before we had the last election. So we had a period of the government reflecting on those. We had the interim report that delivered the spiky recommendations and the echidna on the cover. We're now in a phase where the ATEC, since the 29th of April, has been formally in place, and since the 1st of July, the commissioners, and I'm proud to be leading them. You mentioned a lot of phrases and words around the ATEC, Luke. You talked about steward, and that's embedded in the Act, this concept of stewardship. And I know for many people, there's a question mark about what does that mean? To some extent, I think we're evolving that as we work our way through what is a really important process at the moment, as we analyse the mission-based compacts that universities have submitted and begin then the negotiation phase with universities and begin to discuss with them their planning, particularly for 2027, because we're still transitioning to managed growth funding and needs-based funding. We have an act before the Parliament at the moment to give us that set of levers, that architecture that is fundamental to the recommendations of the Accord and fundamental to the work of the ATEC. So we need to work our way through that legislation, through another Senate inquiry. Hopefully that'll come into place. That will mean our compacts can be signed and we'll have 27 up and away. But there are some key words about the ATEC. You mentioned stewardship. We talk about negotiation. We talk about engagement. We talk about facilitation. We talk about the way in which we will encourage greater collaboration and the way we'll develop a sense of a system operating across tertiary education, and particularly with our universities, in a way that we haven't seen before. And I know one of the phrases that people get particularly concerned about is managed growth, as opposed to the demand-driven system in one form or another that's existed since the Bradley reforms. And of course, managing growth means negotiating the trajectory and the vision for universities consistent with their strategic direction and the envelope, substantial envelope of places we have to distribute. But they're the key elements of it. We're not here to direct the system. We're here to work with universities collectively and individually for the betterment, by the way, of Australian higher education, and to ensure that we can meet the challenges of our nation, of our civil society, of our democracy, to address the challenges of our planet, climate change, net zero, all of these really important national priorities, and to work with universities to achieve that. Now, an element of that, again, consistent with stewardship, is our State of the Tertiary Education System report that we are, under legislation, required to provide to the Minister. We'll do the first foundational version of that in the first quarter of next year. And that's an opportunity to very publicly provide commentary on the system, provide an analysis of what's happening to our universities, and to be able to advocate, in a sense, for them as we consider the challenges they're facing and their critical role they play in Australia.
So Barney, we're going to come to some of the what I call the core functions that are outlined in the bill, and of course the core things that everyone that's already, particularly in our university membership, have been working with you and the team on, particularly those issues, those big issues of managing growth, mission-based compacts. But I want to just come back a little bit to what our thinking was as a collective in the sector and the broader tertiary education system about the idea of stewardship. In the debates we had around the establishment of the bill, there was a lot of discussion around independence, and there was a lot of discussion as well around the work and why the case for a buffer body. So removing it from the kind of very limited policy cycles we have, particularly in Canberra, 3-year political terms. A lot of watchers of global politics talk about midterm elections in the US and, 1 or 2 years of real governing. In Australia, my view is, having worked around this for a long time, is you only get one, if you're lucky, 14 to 15 months of good governing work before you're either side of an election in Australia. So I want to come back to those issues. Then I'm going to unpack some of the kind of core functions you have. And then if we can, think about what the longer term horizon is, because I'm very cognizant of the fact tertiary education is in the title. A lot of the powers you have now is for the management and funding streams and the missions of universities. So I wonder if we could just look at, what does independence mean in the model that we've got with ATEC, and how will that work in practice, and how important do you think it is, your role having that independence from government in developing longer term thinking in the tertiary system, something we all were calling for in the development of the Accord, particularly because we wanted to see long-term funding, long-term stability, and long-term mechanisms for innovation and all the other things we want to see in the system.
No, I think it's a very important topic to begin with, this sense of independence of the ATEC. And I think a lot of debate, and I know on the Implementation Advisory Committee that the Minister set up to provide advice on taking the Accord recommendations through to implementation, that committee debated this question when the draft legislation came forward. What does independence mean, and how can we be confident as a sector? And more broadly, how can we be confident that the ATEC can operate truly independently? And of course, we've established under the Act what's called a secondary statutory authority, which means that the commissioners are independent. They're independent statutory officers, and that's where I believe the true independence lies. I was fortunate to be the Jobs and Skills Australia Commissioner in a very similar structure with Jobs and Skills Australia, again as an independent statutory officer, but where the public servants that are providing support to JSA and to ATEC were seconded from the department, in the case of JSA from DUA and the case of ATEC from Education. And they work under the direction of the ATEC, of the commissioners, through a chief executive. Now, my view is that model can work and will work very effectively, and I'm very, very confident that the ATEC will demonstrate its independence very strongly. I think it already has in some ways, as we begin to discuss and develop our mission-based compacts, completely independent of government. Government set through the Minister a total allocation pool of places and has given us an indication of expectations through an interim statement of expectation, which we've taken into account. But now we're in a process where we are independently allocating that resource, that very substantial resource, across the sector, as well as being involved in many other discussions impacting on universities at the moment. So I think, of course, it will take time for people to be convinced that this model delivers the independence we need for the ATEC. In my view, we will be able to demonstrate that, and I know that I speak on behalf of my fellow commissioners there. They are as intensely aware of their independence as commissioners as I am, and we have had one commission meeting already. We had it on the 1st of July. We're about to release a communique of what came out of that first meeting. We want to be very open and transparent about the work of the Commission, something Mary made very clear as the interim Chief Commissioner. We will be judged by our openness and our transparency with the sector, and we'll be releasing that. And one of the things we did at our very first meeting, Luke, was I signed on behalf of the Commission an MOU with the Department of Education that stipulates the relationship between the ATEC and the department. We rely on them for services, we rely on them for IT support, we rely on them for HR support, and we also rely on their support in a number of ways as we navigate the relationship between the public service and Parliament, but very much setting out the elements of independence that we need to be reflected in that MOU. Now, that's a great step forward on day one. I think we've laid down, if you like, a very clear line in the sand about the ATEC and the department. We have an MOU to govern our relationship. We've got our independent commissioners. We're very committed now to an important process over the next couple of months. Look, the proof is in the pudding, in the eating, ultimately. We need to watch this carefully, and I know the sector will be watching us with a lot of interest, as they need to and should do, but I'm confident that this model is going to work.
One of the things that I think about is the original idea of a universities accord came from the then Shadow Minister for Education, Tanya Plibersek, who in her speech introducing this idea was about resetting the relationship between government and the university sector. And obviously very, very important work then carried through into the Labor government under the then stewardship of Minister Jason Clare and the university's accord process. I'm very interested, and I know everyone on this call is very interested, not just with ATEC's relationship with government, but the relationship it will have with the university sector. We've got now TECSA in its 13th year from last time I checked, or my maths is probably 14th year actually, I should say. You've had Jobs and Skills Australia, which you've had leadership of. How do you want to set the agenda? Obviously, it's great that we're here in week 2 of your official capacity talking with universities through the national peak body. But how do you see developing that relationship, and a really important relationship that I think will be different than that ought to be with the department? It will be different than it ought to be with our regulator. How are you going to go about that, Barney, and the Commission and your very committed staff, and what can we do collectively to drive that ongoing relationship to I think create a buffer body that we both see value in and continue to want to work with?
And I think the key word in all of that, Luke, is relationships, building relationships, managing those relationships effectively, engagement with stakeholders. I think UA, as a former chair of UA, I'm a great believer in our peak body and the role it plays and the incredibly important work it does on behalf of universities, not just engaging in the political context, but engaging across the sector and across a whole range of other interested parties. So we need a very vibrant, powerful Universities Australia and a very, very strong relationship between UA and ATEC. And I'm looking forward to that with the chair of UA, with Carolyn Evans, with yourself. I think this is a really important part of it. We want to meet regularly with the plenary for a whole raft of reasons, to keep them informed about key aspects of what we're doing and also to hear from them. Importantly, we'll be in a process on a regular basis of reaching out to a whole range of stakeholders. One thing I'm doing at the moment in week 2 is to engage with a lot of the mission groups, individual vice chancellors, because of individual circumstances in the sector. So relationship management is key to this. Relationships, building them up, and being open and transparent and accessible and responsive as an ATEC. And I know David Turvey, our acting chief executive, has been doing a great job in just a few months to forge really powerful relationships across the sector and to be the sort of responsive leader of our public servants in the ATEC that I think is giving assurance to the sector that they're being listened to. We're all operating in complex circumstances. We understand the pressures that universities are under. And I say to colleagues in the sector that the ATEC is here to assist and to guide, to facilitate, to enable, and to be another voice in a very, very important set of policy discussions going on in Canberra, involving the department, involving other departments, involving TECSA, involving the Minister's Office, and to bring our perspective as a commission, as an independent voice, into those considerations. I think that's a really important aspect of the buffer body and the steward concept. So I think we need to be judged by the strength of the relationships we build. There are going to be difficult moments that we need to work our way through. I think this process at the moment of launching 42 both Table A and Table B providers, 42 mission-based compact negotiations over the course of essentially August and early September, to enable us to listen to universities about what they're putting in the compact, the direction they're taking, and how we can assist them to achieve that mission within the resource envelope available to us, and to begin to guide the sector towards managed demand-driven equity. These really are the beginning, I think, of developing that set of relationships that's key to our future. Whether it's me as Chief Commissioner or whoever it might be in the future, we have a very clear charter for the Commission, and we'll be publishing that charter, and we approved it at our first meeting, but it really does reflect the values that the ATEC commissioners will bring to the engagement we have with the sector, the negotiations we'll undertake, and the way we'll go about doing our business as a system steward. So I think that's at the key, Luke. We really need to build that, and I'm really pleased at the way UA, under your leadership and Carolyn's, has reached out to ensure that we do have a smooth transition for the new commissioners.
Well, Barney, we're just at the beginning, and we look forward to continuing that. I think it is important that we learn when we work on this together, because the buffer body for us is something that we've made very clear, and I articulated this not only just through the Senate inquiry, but through various consultations Universities Australia had with crossbenchers, with other parts of the sector, with our relationships with the business community. I want to focus now on the actual powers that have been allocated to a couple of things around that are really pertinent, and you've mentioned already mission-based compacts. And of course, there's some legislation before the Senate at the moment, which you've touched on, which is the Universities Accord, Opening the Doors of Opportunity Bill. I think it might be important for some people on this call that we have a quick trip down memory lane, so to speak, because it's the funding authority to give places, and the funding powers that you have at ATEC are incredibly important, and they are very powerful. But I wonder if we might unpack where we've been in the last couple of years. So I think going back to the Bradley reforms and the late 2000 to the late noughties into the 2010s, then Julia Gillard and other ministers, including Chris Evans, who I work for, there was a desire to see more growth in the university system. There's a desire to see more equity in the system. These things are logically flowing through into this Labor government period as well. And the mechanisms decided at that point in time, we had a Higher Education Pathways and Participations Program, HEP, which supported building aspiration for tertiary study, and a desire to have more students come into the system. The mechanism chosen then, Barney, as you and I both remember quite well, was a demand-driven system. So a system based on student demand. Universities could enrol as many students as they like. There, interestingly, was a transition, a glide path upwards in 2009, 10, 11, where universities were allowed to over-enrol. We then had a period of lumpiness. We had a previous coalition government that paused the amount of money that we could get attached to university places. We had the emergence of university places with the student contribution only. We had the emergency policy settings of the maximum base grant amount becoming the minimum amount during the higher education funding continuity guarantee, as really a compensation, I would say, for not getting a JobKeeper in that terrible COVID period. We've had a very, very big debate around job-ready graduates at that time, changes in the student contributions, the changes in the amount we get paid for each student, still continuation of that marginally funded student, and then, of course, the management of international students. You'd forgive us in saying the system has got messy, And we're now moving into a new period. And I wonder what, if you can touch on what is the overall aspiration that the government and ATEC want to achieve through managing the growth of funding, through this new uncapping or, managed equity, demand-driven equity, and the other mechanisms in place that really tidy up some of these issues. I think this is a conversation we've been having, but we haven't. I'm really keen to have it with you now, Barney, to really focus on that messiness and lumpiness we've had out of necessity, out of policy changes, out of dealing with the pandemic, but really where are we at today? What are we trying to solve, and where are we heading into the future? I know it's a big question, but I think it really is important that we unpack some of these things so we better understand it.
No, you're right to say it has been a challenging 20-year period in lots of ways, from the demand-driven system through to jobs-ready graduates, now into managed growth funding, a range of reforms, some successful ones, some unsuccessful ones in the system that led to all sorts of outcomes, including capping Commonwealth subsidies. The Accord made it fairly clear about the objectives that Mary and the Accord panel were very committed to. We could see the need, based on the modelling that we did during the Accord process, which JSA also looking at long-term needs of our labour market from a skills perspective, still recognising, even in an AI-infused future, I might say, Luke, that we're going to need to see more tertiary qualified people in the Australian labour market over the next 20, 25 years. So to reach that 80% attainment figure that the Accord recommended, 80% of working age population with tertiary qualifications by 2050. That is an aspirational target for the nation, and one that we believe is necessary if Australia is to prosper. Now, to achieve that, we've got to ensure that the natural corollary of that is to ensure that we uplift all Australians to participate to their full potential in tertiary education and in the Australian labour market, both for the enormous reasons we know that tertiary qualification, that education makes a difference to people's lives, and it also makes a difference to the Australian economy and our productivity. So it's a vital part of that future. So a very simple set of propositions. One, we have to uplift participation in tertiary education. Two, we have to bring those who have been disadvantaged in one form or another, and notwithstanding the successes in aggregate terms of the demand-driven system, and the marginal demand-driven system we've had in recent years, we need to uplift more students from an equity background to participate in higher education in this country. And we need to encourage more First Nations students. And we need to remember that First Nations students are not part of managed growth funding. They're already demand-driven funded. And it's important to remind people of that when they think about the way in which the system is going to operate. So in that context, with that very ambitious target, you needed a government willing not only to acknowledge the importance of sustaining our tertiary education system, and particularly our universities, but improving the relationship between vet and higher ed, but also to allocate sufficient places for growth, because sustainability to our system is going to require a way of managing the way we grow to achieve those ambitious targets, but also to ensure that we bring all universities and all of our communities, whether they're regional or outer metropolitan or our big research intensive universities, along successfully on that journey. To do that, we needed to do a number of very important things that you have alluded to. One, we need to move the sector to full funding. The growth in marginally funded load, which I'm sure our audience today would appreciate, that is the number of student places in the system that are only funded through student contributions and not Commonwealth subsidies, has grown to be a significant component of the system. And the Accord made it clear, we cannot partially fund or marginally fund something as vital to Australia's future, something that UA advocates for so passionately. Our universities cannot be marginally funded. We've got to move the system towards full funding. So that need for full funding, that need for growth, and that need to ensure that we can manage demand-driven equity into the future are the components that the ATEC is committed to leading in concert with the sector, in negotiation with the sector. And I think that's the powerful piece. This won't work if we don't have a government willing to allocate the places necessary for that growth. And it's important to note that ATEC, Luke, in a very real way, allocates places, not funding. Funding flows from those places being allocated. And the Commonwealth, in a real sense, is taking the risk on the student profile of universities once we allocate the places to them across the fee-free uni ready right through to postgraduate coursework Commonwealth subsidised. So we're looking for more flexibility for universities. We want universities to respond to national, state, territory and regional priorities. That's an accountability measure I think we can all accept. When we're receiving public funding, we should be receptive to those national, state, territory and regional priorities, and to be very much focused on uplifting those from an equity background to participate to their full potential. So the responsibility of the ATEC is to bring universities with us as we achieve those very ambitious targets with the load profile to distribute that's adequate for the purpose, I might add, and with the new legislation enabling us to draw down through the approval of the minister additional places if we believe we need more places to address equity in the system. So that's a very powerful tool in the new legislation. So I think we have the architecture here that was designed very much by Mary and the Accord team with the ATEC now and with the profile of places that we can deliver on that very challenging set of aspirational targets. And I think Australia needs that. In my mind, it's become even more apparent with the debate around AI, and it's become more apparent to me, both at JSA and at ATEC, that we have got to get the interface between TAFE, vocational education and training, and higher education to be as seamless as we can make it, because that's a critical part of pathways into higher ed and pathways into vocational education and training. So I know that's a lot in there, but in my mind, we are moving away from really quite toxic competition and marginal funding in a semi-demand driven context with all of the challenges you outlined, to a system with much more management, much more stewardship, much more negotiation to address the growth we need and to bring the sector and particularly equity students with us.
It's a really great way to jump on in a discussion around mission-based compacts. That is the mechanism that is provided for the ATEC to allocate these places and in fact allocate international numbers. Mission-based compacts are not a new idea. In fact, I kind of wonder how old I'm getting when I remember the last lot of mission-based compacts we had under then Minister Kim Carr and of course Julia Gillard and others back in the Rudd government. I sat on both sides of those in my very short time in the bureaucracy, but also in the sector on some of those negotiations. One of the challenges I think we had back then, Barney, was a lot of the funding, because it was student demand driven, was guaranteed. So the discussions were quite minor, really, about the reallocation of places. Often it was, in my context, can we allocate some load here from postgraduate to sub-bachelor or the other way around, or can we have more then enabling course load, or can we have something else? This is a much more meaty and much more thoughtful but ambitious, but some have characterised as potentially controlling mission-based compact mechanism. You've got a lot of authority there. I want to touch on this idea of both the national system, the national mission and objective for the tertiary education system, which you've touched on. Importantly, it really, really is important that we all back the aspirations for effectively a universal access to post-secondary education system, with universities at the centre of that public system and that public response, but also what a mission-based compact looks like, because you could critique it at this stage. It's just the allocation of places. Barney, how do we get those mature conversations happening? I know your team has gone and met more than 40 universities, all of my 38 members and the others in the system over the last very short period, I might add. So a shout out to your team and our respective universities for that rapid work. How do we evolve that into just what could feel like here is your allocation and you're done? what does a real mission-based compact look like for an individual institution and its role within a national system. And the other thing I think I'd like to explore is this idea of the statement of strategic priorities, because I think for the first time, the national system is looking at what the local needs are. This actually kind of comes out of thinking of the Kangan review of that established TAFE, that you'd look at the local need in the context of national need for vocational education and training. This is quite exciting, Barney, but how will it evolve? And how it will genuinely be a discussion and negotiation, and where will individual universities be able to articulate that mission and have it endorsed within a national framework and a national conversation?
No, it's a good question, Luke. I mean, we are very committed to the diversity. A lot of people talk about Australia's higher education system, particularly our universities, and think of them as homogenous. I don't see them that way. I think they're very different institutions. They have different missions. They have both regional, local, state and territory and national particular foci. So I think we have a very diverse system. I think we need greater diversity over time, and that's something we might want to talk about. Mission-based compacts, that was the phrase we used to reflect two really important things. Mission-based, in other words, we're here to discuss with a university its mission, what we can provide and how we can assist that university to achieve its mission, a mission that is aligned with the strategic direction of the university, the governing body, the management, the staff, the students, the community that university serves both nationally and internationally. How do we assist in the achievement of that mission? And a compact to be something beyond an agreement or a legal document. And I think that's what Kim Carr had in mind in that period when mission-based compacts emerged. In this context, we haven't defaulted to a Commonwealth agreement as the phraseology we want to use, even though it is very much a binding document of agreement between the parties, but very much to say we'll be driven by, we'll be participating in those negotiations on the basis of an institution's desire to achieve its mission. So I think there's a key element here that differentiates it very strongly from mission-based compacts that we once had. And yes, you're right, there's a very strong allocation of places, an agreement around targets, an agreement around performance. That's an important part of public accountability for the way in which public funding is used. And we've attempted to negotiate that through an interim statement of strategic priorities. I think that's going to become an incredibly important guide to universities, influenced, yes, by a statement of expectations from a minister, but importantly, we're about to embark on the consultation around the first statutory statement of strategic priority, which is to be delivered by the early part of January next year. And that will guide the 2028 to 2031 compact negotiations. Come back to your point about getting us out of election cycles in this country, to move through this first year and then to move into a 4-year negotiation where we will update the statement of strategic priorities every 2 years to make sure we're responding to the needs of the Australian people and the Australian economy and our communities. But to have an opportunity, I think, Luke, to negotiate with the sector around the statement of strategic priorities, that deep consultation we want to do, is going to be an important part of shaping that document that then universities will respond to in developing their 4-year compacts. And we'll go through an annual cycle of review, an annual cycle of updating as required in terms of load distribution as universities manage the vagaries of student response and students taking up offers and places, hopefully seeing the growth that we expect in equity and load more broadly, but to have an opportunity to have that conversation on a regular basis. So from my perspective, we have a very, very important instrument of guidance through the Statement of Strategic Priorities. It is an instrument of guidance that we will do through develop through a very detailed consultation process, and that we'll be able to ensure that reflects the broad guidance universities need to enable them to achieve their mission. And hopefully that cycle of evaluation and feedback and renegotiation is going to give us, I think, a very stable, very sustainable, a very consistent policy frame. And the thing that universities need is some stability in the trajectory over the next few years. Luke, with all of the other challenges they face, the last thing they want is a whole lot of volatility in domestic load. And international. We've seen the decision of government to hold the national planning level constant for 2027, building off the 2026 level. I think we're looking at a period where the national planning level will not be growing. I think we need to acknowledge that's going to be a challenge. We need, in that case, to have very, very, very stable domestic load opportunities for growth over the course of the next few years, and give universities that ability to plan against their mission in the context of a mission-based compact for their future with a great deal of confidence. I think that's a key characteristic of what this new approach should bring.
Barney, everyone is going to be applauding this aspiration for stability and certainty, because particularly on international, we have seen so much volatility in policy settings and changes. Still, despite the national planning level, with the big growth that, of course, Universities Australia championed for growth in the system in 2026, the stability in a complex context is welcome. But we want to make sure, of course, that we can actually get students into the system. A vital part of what we do in Australia, a world-class success story in international education. Barney, there are lots of things I'd like to talk about, and it could just be you and me, but I'm conscious of the 1,200 plus people that have signed up to talk, to watch us talk. There are big challenges. I can't not throw the idea of job-ready graduates and the idea of how do we get rid of what I think the Accord has said, certainly our analysis and advocacy says has failed. The students want to see it go, particularly those arts and humanities students, law and economics, who are going to be paying nearly $57,000 for their degree. I'm going to tie this into some questions, though. There are a number of them flowing through, as you can imagine, from our very earnest and thoughtful viewers today. So let's start with JRG. What role will ATEC have in providing advice to government about the reforming JRG, given that we did ask for student contribution advice to be a power of ATEC? That's something we didn't quite get in the negotiations through the Parliament. But what else is ATEC able to do in this space, Barney? And where do you think it'll go from here? A complex policy, I acknowledge that, but something I think everyone wants to see reformed. We can have lots of places in the system, but we want to make sure the settings are fair, both in terms of the students and the contribution that the Commonwealth gives to the universities as well.
No, that's very true, Luke. And you referenced the relationship between the ATEC legislation and student contributions. That was clearly something discussed during the debate around the bill, but ultimately the bill is providing ATEC with a very clear set of guidance around its advisory role with respect to efficient costing and pricing. And it's important to capture both of those elements, both efficient costing, what do we understand to be, what it's costing universities to deliver a quality teaching and learning environment for students right around Australia across our different universities. What might efficient costing look like? And then, of course, what advice we'll give to government about pricing. Now, what does pricing mean in this context? Well, it means what do we believe the Commonwealth subsidies should be in order to ensure that universities have the resources they need to deliver quality teaching and learning at an efficient costing regime and with the right sort of modelling that gives us confidence about the way in which we're providing advice on efficient costing. Now, it is, as I've said in Senate inquiry and I've made public, the natural corollary of that conversation with government is student contribution settings. And this is where the ATEC has a particularly important role to provide that advice to government, and for government taking on that advice, considering that advice and responding to that advice that will importantly be described through our State of the Tertiary Education System report and through other mechanisms. We need to be confident the government responds to that. Now, my view, and I've said this publicly, and I know there's a frustration about the timeframe that I keep talking about when it comes to delivering advice, which is the second half of 2027. That's because this is complex. And one of the reasons that we are doing a lot of detailed work with the sector at the moment is to avoid what happened through the previous exercise about costing and pricing. And that was where the sector was not comfortable with the modelling that was done, in fact, rejected that modelling. And UA has led commentary on this on a number of occasions. Certainly, many university vice-chancellors have, that it did not reflect, the model did not reflect adequately the true cost of delivering in our complex system. Now, one of the first things that Mary O'Kane did as the interim Chief Commissioner for the ATEC last year was to establish a working party made up of comprehensive representation across the sector to provide advice, chaired by Stephen Duckett, to provide advice on what do we need to address to ensure that our work on efficient costing and pricing will be consistent with the understanding of the sector and something the sector is prepared to tolerate. Now, that work, I think, is vital. Yes, it's vital for a government to consider JRG reform. I accept that. But I think it's vital in the context of setting generational change for the funding model for universities in this country. I think
I think that's a really important aspect in what you're going to be doing. And I acknowledge, of course, Universities Australia and I'm on that review panel, and that work is happening at a pace. Before I pivot to some other questions, because we could talk about JRG for a very long time, and we have been talking about it for a very long time, but we want to absolutely avoid this idea of just dealing with the student contribution and then leaving the universities with a big funding gap, or what we've seen in other jurisdictions, like the terrible decision in the UK to actually only have the students contribute with £9,000, then no indexation applied. Catastrophic results in the funding.
And Luke, I think it's really important. I know there have been a number of models put out there which are basically zero-sum ideas. You know, how can we move debt around different groups of students to lower the debt in one place, pushes the debt up elsewhere? Now, in my view, that's not a response to JRG. You might be able to do that partially. It means other students are paying more debt. What we need is to consider this holistically in the context of what efficient costing looks like and the advice we should be giving to government on the funding model.
We look forward to continuing that conversation at pace, Barney, in addition to the other important activities that you have. I've got dozens of questions. Let me try and get through them. There's an excellent question here about research, the role of the steward in research, and what does success really look like for ATEC in stewarding the research system. We have the CERD report. We've had countless reports into the research system. We know that it like JRG is a big area that requires reform, and it's not cheap. From ATEC's point of view, what is your role in that in research stewardship? How does it impact the mission-based compact discussions, and what will evolve over time in your remit and scope with this big important issue for universities?
I think first of all, there were changes to the Act as a result of the debate in Parliament, which strengthened the relationship between ATEC and research. And I think that was, and I believe all of the amendments made to the legislation were very positive contributions, and I think they've strengthened the role of the ATEC, and I'm glad the government accepted those amendments. So we have a very strong relationship with the way in which research policy is set in this country, and importantly, over time, the way in which block grant funding to universities may be allocated. The reason I'm hesitant there is for two reasons. One is we do have CERD, and we are waiting for a government response to CERD. And in that context, I think it's important for the government to consider its position. We'll have the National Resilience and Science Council established in the near future as a key component of that. There's discussion around research specialisation. There are some things happening, but that's not at this stage a comprehensive response from CERD. So the role of ATEC in responding to that is still a matter for government to set that agenda. Equally, ATEC will engage with universities even in this stage, this early stage, when our focus is very much on the distribution of Commonwealth supported places, but equally we want to engage with research. This year, we incorporated it as one of the key domains in the mission-based compact negotiation, particularly focused on research training. This is not so much because we have resources to allocate, but because we want to be better informed about the challenges to our research training system in this country and why we are seeing such challenging circumstances for our PhD students, our Masters by Research students, and for that matter, our postdocs. I know that JSA and the ARC and other agencies are looking at doing a major study on the research workforce in Australia. ATEC wants to be part of that. We understand the challenges around stipend levels. We're collecting more information to incorporate in our advice to government as part of research and to be part of the setting of the long-term research policy agenda for Australia. So it's a critical role to play. It's less defined simply because we have not yet had a government response to CERD.
You've reminded me of one of the most important things, I think, about a deficit, what one might say, in the Australian system is data and information, Barney. And, we've only just got now information from the 2025 calendar year released by the Department of Education and the Minister. What is the role that ATEC will play or ATEC will advocate for in terms of better use of data, better collection of data, better transparency of data? For transparency, obviously, this is a topic that I'm pursuing with great gusto in my capacity as co-chair of the Better Regulation Working Group with Yasmina and the department. But I think it is important that we do move towards a more reliable, more transparent set of data, not only so ATEC can do its work, but of course the sector can then do its own analysis as well. I know you've got a view on data. What are your aspirations for that? I'd love to see ATEC hold the data. I'm not sure we're going to win that battle, Barney, but certainly is there more and better work we can do to improve that, information that we have about the state of the sector and the trends that we see in the sector so we can better prepare for the future?
No, it's a crucial issue, Luke. I know we're in discussion with the department at the moment and other data custodians about the sort of data feeds that the ATEC will need. The ATEC doesn't necessarily need to hold the data, but it does need to have access to pristine data sets for the purposes of understanding trends, as you've put it, but also to work with the sector itself on data, because we need to be, to a certain extent, ahead of some of the verified data. Some of the challenges for universities is the delay that you've just been talking about in getting access to verified data. But we need to work with the sector, and this is very true in the context of managing demand-driven equity. We need to work very closely with the sector in almost real-time context, particularly early in the year, to get a sense of what's the relationship between offers and admissions and what are the universities projecting through to census date, so that we can start to see the balance between equity growth and non-equity growth in the sector, and that can help us to allocate more resources or, in fact, to ask the minister to draw down more resources. So data is a huge challenge, but we're working on it and we're working very closely with the department about it. It's also crucial to tertiary harmonisation. If we want to talk about a more joined up tertiary system, we've got to get better at the data so that students can see for themselves what the best pathway for them will be through a TAFE and doing a diploma and then going on to a university. But we need the sort of data, the portals, the systems that will make that as seamless as possible. We know one thing is very true. You put a barrier in the way of an equity student seeking to improve their lives through tertiary education. If you've got a barrier there, that will drive them away. So we've got to address those barriers, and data is crucial to ensuring we can do that. So it's a big issue. I know you're working on it in the regulation space. We're working on it on tertiary harmonisation. We're working with the department. Big issue.
Great, and let's keep it going because it is so fundamentally important. Barney, we're going to run out of time, but there's one issue I think kind of covers off a whole range of topics, and it's the role of the higher education standards and the threshold standards. We've seen discussion paper out, potential changes to incorporate changes and contemporary reforms to university governance, really important work out of the Expert Council. I acknowledge the Melinda Salento and Sharon Burrow and the Chancellors and Vice-Chancellors and union representatives and sectors representatives on that work. Really thoughtful and important changes, I think, to deal with issues of racism, other key issues, potentially research security in the pipeline. The old Higher Education Standards Panel sat with TEXA. There will be a new Higher Education Standards Committee. This is the first time I've got the title right, so kudos to me today, sitting with ATEC. Talk to us quickly about that, Barney, as we conclude this conversation around why it's important or why the move of that new committee from the old Higher Education Standards Panel should sit in the system steward, and what type of work it will do and how it will shape that work into the future. Because I think there's a lot of talk about new standards in higher ed that is it has a potential to be helpful, but it also has a potential to be a significant regulatory impost.
Yes, look, the Higher Education Standards Panel effectively dissolved on the 29th of April when the ATEC came into existence. It was within the department. TEXA had a liaison, obviously, with the Higher Education Standards Panel, given their regulatory responsibility around standards. The ATEC legislation gives us that responsibility. One of the first decisions we made on the 1st of July was to establish the Higher Education Standards Committee of the ATEC. And we have asked the existing committee to continue on for a further period because we want continuity. We're also looking to make 2 or 3 additional appointments to strengthen the Higher Education Standards Committee under the ATEC. There is a vital role, I believe, for the system steward to play in the maintenance and development of higher education standards and provider category standards in the best interest of the sector, and obviously to work closely with the regulator who's responsible for the regulatory oversight of those standards and their implementation by universities. But given the stewardship model and the consultative model for the ATEC, I think that should be reassuring about the way in which the ATEC will engage as an independent body with the sector when it comes to the maintenance and development of our standards. It is what makes us a world-class system, that we have a world-class regulator and that we have standards and that we're measured against those standards. It's why our tertiary system, where you have ASQA and state regulators alongside TEXA, are so important to us in recognition internationally for the quality of our tertiary education. So from that perspective, I see a very important role for the ATEC and justifying putting the Higher Education Standards Committee within the steward and leaving the regulator to get on with the business of regulation.
We look forward to seeing how that develops and making sure that the independence to that mechanism continues, and I'll continue working with you, as you know, Barney. One last question, and this is an important one. I think it's come from one of our media audience members. This is ATEC and any measure. It's one of the biggest reforms. It's a centrepiece of the reform agenda. It's the biggest we've seen in 40 years. What does success look like for ATEC in 5 years, Barney, as we take out this the tail end of this conversation today?
Well, I think there are multiple measures of success for the ATEC. I don't think we should think about a single concept because we may be not doing justice, I think, to the complexity of the system that we have at the moment. I use words like sustainability and stability and consistency in a very real sense, that we'll have a system that will have the participants in that system that appreciate both its growth and its stability. And by virtue of that stability, we will see greater collaboration within and across our system and greater outcomes for Australia in terms of growth in the number of graduates, in the quality of our research and the impact we have. So those key words will be a feature of it. We will have seen the system grow dramatically. We'll have seen significant uplift in equity student participation in tertiary education. We will have seen, I think, dramatic improvement in a joined up tertiary education system. Those pathways will be real and significant, and we'll see TAFE in particular as at the heart of vocational education and training reform, working very closely with universities in developing new and improved ways of recognising prior learning and to encourage greater work integrated learning. So I can see much, and by the way, when we imagine that future for the system, I think we start to stimulate more creativity and innovation. When you can provide stability and consistency and guidance, people can turn to doing things which the Australian system has been so dramatically good at. And that's to be innovative, entrepreneurial, creative. And in an AI-infused world, Luke, we're going to need much, much more of that. And I want to unshackle the system to enable universities to focus on what they're so good at and why they're so critical to the future of this nation.
Well, Barney, what a wonderful way to finish off that conversation, and a good segue, and maybe even a kind of marker for our next conversation. We did want to talk about lifelong learning. We did want to talk about tertiary harmonisation, AI, so many things that we didn't get to, but the conversation has been wonderful nonetheless. Thank you for all the work you do. Thank you for joining us in your second official week. We look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you to the many, many hundreds of people, if not thousands of people that have joined us today. And I encourage you all, to check out the recording, which we'll upload in the coming hours, I'm told, from my team, and future conversations. Thank you for joining us on this solution series in conversation. Barney, I'm deeply grateful for your time today. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Luke, and thanks everyone.